I'm honored to introduce you to our presenter today. David O'Hara is a president at Improving Enterprises, where he finds joy in facilitating those around him to discover what they need to grow and achieve their best selves. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to David O'Hara, a dedicated father and husband who will be sharing his presentation entitled Conscious Leadership.
Thank you, Jervin, and thank you all for being here. I know it's been quite a week of content with the Improving Edge, and if you missed it, I would encourage you to check out the videos when they drop on our YouTube channel. You'll have access to hear about things like leading from the core. Jay Steinfeld talked about authenticity and values, and Delinda shared about generational leadership and transitions. Also, Dave Rendell talked about embracing your freak and finding your unique gifts. It was pretty inspiring. And then Rodney talking about how Microsoft is stepping up their people leadership and how you can learn from them. I mention all of these things because today you're going to hear a little bit about my journey here at Improving. You're going to hear about our models and some practices and the things that we have done over the last decade, the things that I've done over the last decade, and hopefully you have some takeaways. And actually, I'm going to have a handout for you on the other side of this talk so that you can implement some of these practices. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to take you to a time in the past. It's 2011, and I find myself standing at the edge of a cliff. Not an actual cliff like this. This was a metaphorical one, but it was nonetheless intimidating. See, I had started companies before, but they were just me, and my only responsibility really was me. And this opportunity, this chance really was making me nervous. Now, to be clear, this current cliff, I didn't have any worries about the work. I'm not concerned about that. I'll figure things out. I usually have. But there was going to be 150 people that I'm responsible for. And not just those people, but anybody that depended on them, their families, the kids and spouses. There's like this exponential tree of responsibility that started growing the more I thought about it. And the weight of what I was about to take on was bearing down on me. It really was what was that metaphorical cliff. So I realized that the get it done attitude that had gotten me through all of my past just wasn't going to cut it. I was going to need to lead. But was I prepared to lead? And I knew I was going to have to grow. But how do you grow? How does that work? See, I knew I had gaps and things that I needed to learn. But how do you learn what your gaps are? How do you find those blind spots? How do you grow well? How do you do that? And the job that I had in front of me, honestly, I didn't know. I was standing at the edge of a cliff. Have you ever stood at the edge of a cliff? Have you ever found yourself in this situation? I think so. It's probably why you're listening to us, why you're here. And I share all of this because I want you to know where things that we're about to talk about came from. This is both where I was a decade ago and what has drawn me forward into these practices that I'm going to share today. Before we dive into these practices, I want to talk a little bit about where things are, and it's part of why we put on this conference and why we share everything of what we do is because the current state of leadership development. Our industry, if you take a look at this large body of work that points us to organizations having a gap in their leadership. 77% of companies surveyed said, yeah, I think we have that gap. We're going to have some troubles filling those holes. More precisely, most of our organizations are not equipped to be successful. you see that they feel like their leaders don't possess the competencies and specifically the emotional intelligence to successfully drive these goals. We think that this is part of where the Peter Principle shows up, right? We hear about this all the time. If you know the Peter Principle, it says that people are promoted to the highest level of their incompetence, right? We get to a certain level where that get it done attitude just doesn't cut it. You're out over your skis and you're in trouble. The things called out in this study specifically about competence are important, but oftentimes competence is about skills that we can learn. I think the emotional intelligence piece of this really is the crucial factor here. And that's the piece that I want to ask, do you really know you? There was another study that was done that talked about organizations that develop their leaders' emotional intelligence. They're over 3 times more likely to retain that talent. And we know how important that is right now, especially in this environment, right? The benefits are clear. It's significant in terms of what people will say about their organization, right? You're significantly more likely to say, we have the people that we need to achieve our goals, that we will be able to fill this need moving forward. And I'll take this even a step further and point to the next generation of leaders as a compelling force in this. I know that oftentimes people like to throw rocks at millennials. Personally, I love them because I feel like they are a motivated and energetic group. The largest generation in the workforce in 2022, and they'll represent, I believe it's about 75% of the global workforce by 2025, are those millennials. And over half of them, you see 53%, have leadership aspirations. They have goals to be leaders. They are driven and motivated. And that means they want this as much as you want them to have it. Don't we all want motivated people that can help us guide towards our success? I think we do. Of course we do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, right? And so I'm going to dive into an aspect of our leadership model. It's a model that's been developed here at Improving over a number of years through our experiences, a lot of input from all levels, from our CEO to our presidents to our emerging leaders, have helped us to develop this model. And it's like so many models, but I'm going to focus in on one aspect of the model that I believe helps us understand what transformation takes. Remember that learning that I needed to do as I stood on the cliff? These are the things that helped me. Then I'm going to talk about a couple of practices and how we can implement those. So as I said, I know there's lots of models out there and they're great too. This one is ours. It's may not be perfect, but we feel it fits our business very, very well. It's what we teach internally. And it's something that I'm just going to share this one aspect of. I'm not going to go through the whole of the model, but I'll share this one aspect because I think it is the best piece to put into action broadly for your growth and for the growth that you want to foster in others. So at the core of our model is this concept of transformation, right? We need to be better each day. I want to be better tomorrow than I was yesterday, better next year than I am right now. And in order to do that, to have that growth, it really is around this growth mindset, we need to be able to transform. We talk about the characters of a leader and the characters of a conscious leader, but at the core is this transformation. And it's comprised of 2 pieces that interplay with each other: awareness and courage. So why do you think this is at the center of leadership? for us? Well, as I mentioned, it really is around that growth mindset. It really is around that ability to be better each day. But I'm going to ask, and I know Shervin mentioned the chat in there. So if you want to pop open the chat, I would love to hear your perspective on why do you think awareness is important? So I don't know if I have the chat feature turned on. Oh, there we go. Shervin said, you know who you are, who you socialize with. Ronnie says, understand where you are today and where you want to go, right? Armando, yeah, can't change things that you don't know or aren't aware of. Very true, right? The awareness is important. So I want to take a look at, well, when I say awareness, what do I mean? So awareness really happens on a spectrum, right? We have this unaware, ignorance, and unaware it's our default state, right? It's not noticing that there's a problem. It's where we are if we're not intentional, right? We live in a state a state of unawareness, pretty much walking by all the time. Have you ever gotten in the car and you've driven home and not remembered the travel, not remembered the drive, right? Because we're in an unaware state. There's a great quote by R.D. Lang, a book of his Knots, but he talks about the range of what we think and do is limited, but by what we fail to notice. See, noticing is an intentional effort, and we have to exert that effort, because without awareness, we're just driven by habit, right? We're driven by reactivity. It's the ping of a new message. It's the tap. Well, when we're in the office together, it's the tap of a coworker. Hey, can I ask you a question? It's that state, that default state that we all live in. Now, what happens though is once we have noticed, we now have a choice. What do we do? It's realizing that there is a choice is the first step. And now, once you have realized there's a choice, you have responsibility. You now have the responsibility, which is the bedfellow of freedom and choice, is what do I do with this new awareness? Now, you can always choose ignorance, right? Well, rather you can ignore your awareness, which is technically different than ignorance, because you can say, I'm going to set that aside. I don't think I'm going to approach that. I don't think I'm going to tackle that. But it's only once you have the awareness that you have that choice. And it doesn't erase your responsibility if you do choose to ignore that awareness. Let's just be clear. But awareness alone cannot create transformation. It won't make you a conscious leader. Only growth will. And growth requires that action. It requires you to do something, to exert that effort, right? So there's effort in building awareness, and then there's the effort as I move it to action, as I take that next step. So if there's questions along the way, as Shervin has mentioned, feel free to throw things into the Q&A, and I'll make efforts to make sure that I'm answering those as we go. But I want to talk a little bit more about awareness. As we dive into awareness, there's actually multiple types of awareness. There's three types of awareness that we look at. So there's awareness of myself, of me. There's awareness of others. And then there's situational awareness. There's context, right? The environment. There's lots of different things that go on around us that we can be aware of. And you can see our awareness really has a boundary, and people talk about objectivity. Like, how objective can you be? Well, that objectivity is the boundary of where our stories meet reality. And so what we are working to do is exert our efforts so that our stories marry up with reality. And we want to expand that objectivity. There's lots of different ways to gain awareness, right? We can have assessments like DISC that tell us some of our behavioral tendencies. We have strength finders that talk to character, or EOI that talk about emotional intelligence. I can go on and on, right? We know all of these different models, these different assessments that help. We also can have our trusted people, ask them for their perspective, ask them to share what it is they see, what it is they think of us, what it is they notice. That can help us out with our blind spots. And these are all interrelated in terms of our awareness. But we have to recognize that as we ask for other people's perspective, there's probably going to be some baggage that's going to come along with that, right? Because it's influenced by their own perspective, their own stories, just like we are influenced by our stories. What we realized is as we increase our awareness, because of the interrelated nature of these three types, we often increase our awareness in the other areas. And it's this interplay that we leverage in our practices. So as I increase my awareness of myself, because that's the thing I can control, that's the thing I can focus on, right? It's hard to focus on awareness of others, right? Because there's some back and forth. So we focus in on ourselves and say, how do we grow awareness of ourselves? Now, before I dig into that too much further, I want to talk about what impacts our awareness, what can influence it. It's what we call blurred vision, right? That reality, that boundary of objectivity often is blurred by many things, right? Our worldviews, our past experiences, can be what we want to be true, our desires, not necessarily what is true, but what we want to be true. Oftentimes it can be blurred by our fears, our personal biases. If we do ask people for their opinions, it can be blurred by their baggage, right? Their own blurry vision bleeds into my blurry vision, as well as our own human nature to selectively choose facts, right? And use air quotes, choose things. And then our own pride sometimes gets in the way of our stories. There's many, many things that can blur our vision, that impact this boundary between our stories and our reality. And it's important to be aware of those to the best of your ability. It's important to think about those as we're looking at these practices and ask ourselves the question of, what is my story? What's going into my story? So that I know where I may have some of this blurred vision. So the key that I mentioned before, when we talked about awareness, was looking at the awareness of self and saying, if I can become more aware of myself, my feelings specifically, it unlocks for me empathy. And so by increasing that self-awareness, we unlock that empathy, and focusing on myself and my feelings causes me to unlock and better understand others. Empathy becomes that key to unlocking awareness of others. And so in realizing, again, that interplay between these types of awareness, we now have a starting point, right? It's all about my self-awareness of my feelings. And so that's the practice that I'm going to share with you today. The first of the two practices that I'm going to share with you today is the practice of noticing and becoming more aware of your feelings. So I'm going to ask you right now in the chat, answer this question. How do you feel right now? I feel. How are you feeling? Ronnie is joyful. Brian is energized. Shervin is content. Claudio's grateful. Krupa is confident, amazing. Mondo is happy, grateful. Quite the range of emotions. So many of you may have seen this emotional wheel before. These are our emotions. If you've seen this emotional wheel, there's 130 of them on this wheel specifically. Studies have shown, though, on average, people can name 3 emotions: happy, sad, and angry. And these emotions, our inner state, are what drives our behavior. We experience this all the time, right? Like you've probably said, or maybe heard somebody say, "Oh, you made me so angry that I did something." Or my day was ruined because she, right? And so we let these feelings, that our inner state, drive our behaviors. So it's really important that we take control of these and understand these emotions, these feelings. Now, one thing, and I know it may be hard to see because the wheel is a little bit small, hard to read. But as I mentioned, there's 130 emotions on here. And if we slice this up, you can see the difference between the majority of emotions. Over 70% of them are predominantly negative. And the minority, which is less than 30% of them, are positive. This means our default natural state is most likely going to be in those negative emotions. But with intentionality, we can live into those positive emotions. But again, it goes back to that takes effort, right? It takes intentional thought and effort for us to make sure that we're living into those. And it's a choice, and choice that we have to continually make, right? Because of this imbalance, because there is so much more on that side. And we recognize this oftentimes in our interactions with other people. And we're not always going to be perfect and land in the happy state everywhere. We're not saying that everybody should be an eternal optimist. That's not the case. But it's about recognizing when we are in those negative emotions. And I believe that it's important that we not only recognize it, but that we feel them, that we acknowledge them, that we process them. Brene Brown talks about the fact that you can't selectively numb emotions. When we numb the painful emotions, we also numb the positive ones. We need to be really careful that we're not doing that, right? That we're not turning down the dial on our emotions because we find ourselves in that negative state. Rather, that we figure out why we are there, that we dive into and feel and process those emotions. So the practice that I'm sharing is called Name That Emotion. It starts out pretty simple. Start out in the center of the wheel. Like I said, there's 130 of them. So best place to start is in the middle. We have here our 7 basic emotions. And so you start at the center and you say, how am I feeling? You know what? Feeling pretty happy. But then you ask yourself the question, what am I really feeling? Well, happy might actually be proud. Yeah, I'm feeling proud. Had a good day today. Presentation's going well, had a great morning, feel like there's a lot going on this afternoon. I feel like I'm doing a good job. It's proud. But is it really pride? Well, actually, I'm going to try and make the step one further out in the ring and say, what's the next level of feeling? Actually, feeling confident. I feel like I'm doing a good job. I feel like this is good. And so spending time thinking about what is the emotion that I'm feeling, and not just that high level emotion, not just happy or sad or mad, but what is the deeper root of that is the practice that I'm sharing. And so I'll have a handout that I've built that I use. And this is a snapshot of it. So it's a PDF that I'm happy to share with everybody. But it has the wheel on there. And I have check-ins set 3 times a day where it just goes off and I check in. Where am I at? What am I feeling right now? And then to make sure that I'm processing, it's why? Why do I feel confident? Well, here's some of the things that are going on right now. Why am I feeling so disappointed? Man, you know what? I really let this person down. I didn't follow through on a commitment that I had. And spend a little bit of time that help me to process, why am I feeling what I'm feeling? And make sure that I am feeling those emotions. And I will tell you, after going through just 2 weeks of this deliberate practice, how much more aware I am of what state I'm feeling and where I'm at has now allowed me then to see those emotions in other people. I now understand when, man, seems like you're having a rough day, and helping someone else to process through what it is that they're feeling, what it is that they've got going on, maybe even where their stories are. And I can give them a little bit of that objectivity and help them with that boundary between reality and stories. It's been very, very key in helping me to grow my self-awareness and unlock that empathy, so then I can lean in and help others to become aware of their emotional state, to help them with their stories, and oftentimes to help me with my own story, because I find myself sometimes in that disappointed state or feeling just dejected and like I'm not succeeding. And then I'm able to back up and say, all right, what's the reality? Where is that boundary of objectivity? Where do my stories butt up against this? I will tell you a big piece of this journey for me has been all around journaling. So we talk about this in a lot of our programs, writing things down. There's something, I want to say almost magical, about writing stuff out, getting it out of your head. I know a lot of people say, well, I think about things. And when you think about them, that helps. But when you write them down, it causes you to take it to the next level of depth, because you have to formulate all of the words. You have to put it down, which is why I use physical devices like this one in writing it out, because it makes me think through and feel through all of what's going on. So I would encourage you to print this out, give it a try, spend a couple of weeks playing the name that emotion game and seeing where you are and seeing what you recognize and seeing where your stories might lead.
David, I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
Earlier, you showed the slide with 3 different types of awareness. And I know everybody can't, or maybe some can, typically don't master all 3. If you are working with a leader who is lacking in one of those areas, what, from your experience, is a way to help bring them more self-awareness or awareness to reality? Basically, how do you help somebody grow who maybe should be helping you grow? But like, what would you do? What advice would you give somebody?
Yeah. So I would say that's somewhere to be very careful, right? You can't make someone else grow. They have the saying, you can lead a horse to water, right? But you'll drown it trying to make him drink. You can't force growth. You can only build awareness. And so it does come down to, what are the ways that you can help that, that objectivity boundary, the line between stories and reality. Oftentimes for me, it's about asking them questions and helping them dive into, what are your stories? What's the story you're telling yourself? Finding yourself in a situation. I actually just had this week. Someone came to me and said, oh, let me tell you what's going on, and had a whole story that they laid out for me. And simply by diving into some questions about, why do you think this is true? Or why do you think this is untrue about the situation, about the other individual, about themselves? Asking those questions help them to explore, where is that boundary between where their story butts up against the reality? And you can help unlock that awareness for them. But you can't make them necessarily grow. Did that answer the question?
Oh, it did. Thank you. The asking questions with purpose, I think, is a very important thing to do.
Armando had a question. Let's see. Share some best practices you've discovered to locate future and potential new leaders and how to empower them from the get-go. Ooh, that's a whole nother talk, but a great question. And mentorship you've developed towards someone you detected early on. Well, I would say yes. So improving has been, I'm a product of improving, recognizing potential. Again, it's a whole nother talk about how you identify emerging leaders. We have several ways that we go about that. And so I don't necessarily want to take us off. We'll see where we get to in the end, but I may come back to that. I want to answer also, Krupa asked, how often or how frequent should we ask these questions? I think that we don't ask questions as much as we probably should, especially when we feel like we're in a position of leadership. Far too often we show up feeling like we need the answer, when if we ask questions, we allow others to find the answer, and they grow more when they explore and find that answer all unto themselves. So I usually start conversations with questions. And if you can spend the first, call it 20, 30% of the conversation asking questions, I think that that's a good rule of thumb. Now you may ask more questions along the way, clarifying questions, and come back to make sure that you're clear about where those stories are and where the reality is. But it really is, it is a good place to start, because then you know that you're aligned in terms of where this person is and where you are, or at least your understanding of where they are. So great question. And Armando, don't let me get away with not following up. That's a longer conversation. but one that I'm definitely interested in having. So I want to step into the second piece of this model, right? So we talked about awareness, but it's courage. And courage is stepping into the arena, right? With this new awareness, we have some decisions we have to make. What do we do? Or rather, I would ask, what do we do differently? See, with courage, there is fear. So remember, fear is one of those base emotions. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is it I really fear? Well, I fear being excluded or exposed. I fear being inferior or inadequate. I fear many things. I mean, we all do. We all have imposter syndrome, right? I mean, imposter syndrome, for anybody that doesn't know, is the idea that if they just knew how little I know or the real me, that I might get fired or I might be ostracized. I might be pushed out. And the interesting thing about imposter syndrome is the highest incident of it is in high-performing individuals. It's in the very people that are capable and competent to do the job that are concerned that they aren't going to be, that they're going to be found out, right? And not be able to do the job. Now, remember, confidence does not equal competence. So you may run into those people that act like, I don't have imposter syndrome. And, be careful. I don't want to digress too far, but I would say, remember that we all have fears. We all have concerns. And it is the emotion that we most often react to. Usually the reaction is you freeze. Well, courage is not the absence of fear, right? It's not that overconfidence. It's making motion, taking motion in the face of that fear. Meg Cabot, this quote from her, right? Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is far more important than fear. It's recognizing that I might have fear. I might be fearful. I might be feeling exposed or inferior or inadequate, but it's about doing it anyway. It really is, courage is it's a muscle. It's something we can exercise. It's something we can choose to do because it's motion in the face of that fear. And remember, awareness alone can't create transformation. It doesn't make you a conscious leader just to be aware. Only growth will do that. And that growth requires action. And so fear is what stops courage, is what compels us to move. Even if the fear is still there, you're not going to make it go away, but you're going to choose to move forward in the face of it. And so, because all life happens in great quadrants, and we have a quadrant of our own when we take and we put together this fear, or this courage and awareness, right? So you have awareness and ignorance, and then you have courageous action and complacency, fearful inaction, that freeze. So this is the one we've arrived at for our model. And if you take a look at the different areas of this, these quadrants, you see if I'm unaware of things and I'm not doing anything, that's really the status quo. And quite frankly, this is where we live most of our life because it's that default state that we talked about before, right? Is I'm going through life, I'm responding to, just the reactivity that shows up, my habits that show up, going through the day-to-day standard motions. This is really where we live by default, is the status quo. Now, we could choose to do things and jump off a cliff in our ignorance, taking this courageous action, but really that's recklessness, right? Not having a true understanding of where your challenges are and just throwing darts, that's recklessness. Rather, what we would like to go for is above the line as we raise our awareness, even if we choose not to do anything. And remember, with awareness comes choice. Now, I can choose to ignore that awareness, and I have understanding. I know it's there, but I'm just not doing anything with it. And that brings us to that final quadrant, what we call transformation. I have the awareness. While I have the fear, I choose to lean in, to do something, to exercise that muscle. And that's what will create transformation for us. That is what will help us to grow. And so the second practice that I'd like to share is around that courage, right? So if courage is motion in the face of this fear, motion is something that we can exercise. We can choose, we can choose, we can choose. And so what I use to exercise this is what I call a courage journal. As I mentioned before, journaling has been one of the keys to my growth over the last decade, and probably much longer than that even. Sitting and thinking a little more deeply by writing things down is how I've gone about this. And I have some very specific structure to a courage journal. Now, some of you may have used a gratitude journal before, or used other journaling methods to journal with a spiritual practice or something like that. This is specifically around courage. And it starts with the story. And I usually ask myself these two questions. What's the worst that could realistically happen? And what's the best possible outcome? And I write them down. And the way I start these courage journals is I go back to that sheet of emotions that I've tracked in that sheet. And because there is plenty of material there, I can go find somewhere that I was in a negative space. I was feeling disappointed. Okay, so dive into that. And I use that as the prompt to pull forward into my courage journal. What's the best possible outcome? Man, this is what this could look like. This is how this could go. This is what I want. And then I test it out and I say, okay, so what's one small thing I could do? Remember that exercise, that muscle? What's the little exercise? You don't go to the gym, throw all the plates on the bench and get under that and just grit it out and give yourself a really good bench press. That's not how you start. You start small. Start with the simple. What's one small thing that I could do that would help me to move the ball forward, to help me to take a step into what it is I'm fearful of? And then, because it's not just important for my growth, but it's important because I want to help others grow and I want them to help me and join me on this journey, I get feedback. I have a group of folks that are my safe folks, right? They're my people. And so spending time talking through with them, here's what's going on. And someone that I can safely ask questions. Do they experience me in this way? Kind of like what Shervin was saying earlier, was asking earlier about like helping to grow, because we're all having these types of experiences. We're all struggling in these challenges. And when we can bring others along on our journey, it makes us more authentic and relatable as leaders. It allows us to help each other as we go and as we grow, and it builds relationships, because relationships really are the most important thing. My team hears from me all the time. Relationships are the currency of life, is what I believe. And they're the most important thing that we can invest in. So I would encourage you, as you go through with this name that emotion practice, take it that step further with the courage journal and dive into your story, testing it out, figuring out what is that one step that I can take, that bit of courage that I can show up with, and then finding your tribe, your people. Who is it that you can safely discuss this with becomes super important. So those are the practices. I definitely have enjoyed spending time growing, utilizing these. I'm excited to be able to share them with you, and look forward to hearing from you in terms of how they help you and how they've impacted you. Along those lines, I'd ask, this is my email address. Send me your stories. Send me your messages, your shares of how this goes for you. Give it a try. Commit to 2 weeks. It's not that long. It's 10 days, right? Try it out. And then let me know what it is you experienced, what it is you've thought. Jump down into the chat. It looks like Brian
Question from Brian.
has, somebody online.
Have you seen similar benefits both personally and professionally using this model?
Oh, yes. Well, there is this mistaken belief in my mind of the difference between work me and personal me. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the reality is it's all me. There isn't a delineation between work and home. You are you wherever you go. Now, we may show up in different ways. We may carry different facades and some of those sorts of things, but you are you. And when you increase in your awareness of yourself and your emotions, that shows up when your kid tips over their milk for the 5th time, or when you say that rude thing to your spouse or your significant other, when the person cuts you off on the tollway and nearly hits you. It's something that's helpful across all the boundaries of your life because it's impactful to you as a person, as a human being.
David, you have a request from Unway. He's asking, can you reshare the slide right after blurred vision?
Reshare the slide right after blurred vision. I can jump back.
And while you're doing that, I have a question for you, David.
Sure.
What would you tell people, and when I say people, I mean me, about getting into journaling and starting off? Like I write stuff down. I've done it more since I've joined Improving, but I never did it before. And so that's often the hardest thing to do is start. What would you say to encourage somebody, and maybe an example of the benefits you have of going back to look at something you wrote last week, last month, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I would say with journaling, the key is don't overthink it. Just, you have thoughts running around in your head all the time. I mean, I know as guys, sometimes we get into our boxes, right? We get into an empty box and there's nothing going on upstairs. But we have thoughts that are happening all the time. Just write them down. Start there. Don't overthink it and don't try to make it too complicated. And because when you start doing that, the first thought leads to a second thought, leads to a third thought. And those can be really, really, they can be meandering, but they can also be helpful and can be good jumping off points. So that's one thing that I've used in the past. The second is going and picking up like a gratitude journal. gratitude journals tend to have little prompt sentences and can give you a starting point if you continue to struggle to find a place to start. I know that I like just journaling. Here's how I'm feeling, and obviously, and going from there, because you're also having feelings all the time.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see.
You get one. How not to make people. Oh, they're commenting. What do you spend the biggest part of your work day? Excuse me. How do you spend the biggest part of your day outside of work?
The biggest part of my day outside of work. Oh gosh, that's part of that's hard to answer, because I go back to, I believe in work-life integration. And so what's inside of work, what's outside of work, really is a blurred boundary for me. Just this morning on our stand-up, I was talking about the fact I'm on vacation all next week with my family. That said, I know a couple of things are likely. I will definitely be in improving gear, because I'm in improving gear pretty much all the time. And I will definitely talk about the place that I work, because I love it. And if I love working here, gosh, why wouldn't I talk about it? So I don't know that what was inside of work and what is outside of work. That said, I love being, I'm very much into athletics. I love being outside, whether that's golfing, gardening. I do enjoy playing Xbox with my 14-year-old son. So I am still a gamer. And so these are things that I tend to fill up the weekend with, if that's the question that you're asking. Somebody mentioned How to Win Friends and Influence People. Yeah, great book. That's another one. There are some excellent resources out there in terms of books that focus on relationship building and how to better connect with people. That's one of them.